Welcome to a TGIF edition of Village in Motion. It is Friday, it is June 14th. Father's Day is right around the corner. I want to get right into our topic because we have a lot to talk about today, and I am just thrilled and excited to be your host, Diane Gatsis Havinga. I'm going to introduce our special guests, and then I'm going to throw it over to one of our residents, Marvin, to kind of facilitate our discussion. But first, Vivian Watts, who is our representative in the Virginia 39th District, which includes, of course, Green Spring. And maybe we'll touch a little bit before I let Marvin start in terms of the geographic cutoffs of your district. If you kind of, I won't put you on the
generally,
spot.
I'm centered around the mixing bowl of the Beltway, 95, 395, go up to Landmark, almost down to the Occoquan, but also out almost to the Fairfax Hospital. So I have the older part of Springfield and part of Annandale.
Great. And then a lot of people know Marvin. Marvin is one of our residents, Wagner, and he is a former, I guess you're always an attorney, aren't you?
Yes, we don't cease to be an attorney.
You do. So,
I'm still a member of the bar.
And he's a member of the bar, and next to him is Janet Cook, who's also one of our residents here. And so we're going to just jump right into it. The 19th Amendment, I'm going to have Marvin explain exactly what the amendment is and why it is so significant.
Okay. Women traditionally had not the right to vote, and they sought the right to vote back in 1848. That's when the movement began in Seneca Falls in New York. And the movement didn't really start until after the Civil War, when Congress passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Excuse me. Obviously, the 13th Amendment dealt with the abolition of slavery. The 14th had civil rights granted to people of color, and the 15th gave them the right to vote. The initial movement by women were the 14th Amendment, which, if I may just briefly, talks about the civil rights of all citizens, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protections of the law. And the women felt that this was sufficient for them to be able to vote. The Supreme Court said no. And of course that started the movement even further. There were basically two women's groups. One was a placid group. Susan B. Anthony was known to be in that part. And the other was a much more progressive group. And we'll talk about the history of what happened in 1917 and 1918. But the other point I wanted to make was that a lot of people don't realize that the states individually did a great deal about women's voting rights prior to 1917. And there were literally 15 states that had granted women the right to vote, starting in 1890 with Wyoming and ending with South Dakota and the territory of Alaska. There were no southern states in any of them, and surprisingly, there was only one northeastern state, New York, which had granted it. Most of these were western and some midwestern states.
Would that allow them to vote in federal elections,
no,
or just the
just
state and local elections?
No, they couldn't vote in federal elections. The original bill in Congress to allow women to vote was introduced in 1878. Finally, in 1919, Congress submitted the 19th Amendment to the states for ratification. Now, we really have two centennials. One is this year is when Congress passed the amendment, and next year, 2020, will be when the states ratified the amendment. And it really didn't take effect until the ratification. But they were able to get the states to ratify it in in 1920. The language of the 19th Amendment was almost identical with that of the 15th Amendment, which granted the slaves the right to vote. This is the 15th Amendment. The rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state, that's important, on account of race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. And the 19th Amendment says, the rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. So they simply changed race to sex, and that's where we are today. The last point I'd like to make is the contribution by Woodrow Wilson. I had given a series of lectures on presidents, and Woodrow Wilson was not one of my favorite presidents, but here he was very instrumental in getting Congress to enact the 19th Amendment. And initially he was opposed to it, but you had this second group of progressive women when the war broke out in 1917. Prior to that, they were picketing the White House, trying to get Wilson to change his mind, and he wouldn't do it. So they started picketing it. And then when the war broke out, they decided they're going to continue picketing it, and a lot of people thought that this was unpatriotic. And they literally arrested these women, sent them to jail because they refused to pay a fine. They went on a hunger strike in jail, and they finally were released when Wilson said, okay, I'm changing my mind. And then he really pushed Congress to get that elected. Without him, it would not have gone through, at least then. So that's what I think of as the historical background of the 19th Amendment.
And if I'm not mistaken, and Janet, you could correct me, where were those women jailed at?
Lorton. Those of us who've been to the workhouse, which is now an art gallery and museum, have seen the place where this hunger strike took place. And several of the women were force-fed. It was not a gentle incarceration. And that helped, I think, move public opinion to allow Wilson to release them.
And we're talking about single women and mothers and older women. I mean, it was a wide range of ages and
yes,
and cultures and
mostly young. They were young women, mostly, yeah. And the other group of women were very opposed to the actions that they were taking, like picketing the White House in wartime. So there was quite of a feud between the two groups.
So Vivian, what's your sense of that? Being that you were probably one of the first female representatives elected in Virginia.
Quick history on that. After the right to vote was granted then, and finally by ratification of the states in 1920, the first two women were elected to the General Assembly in 1924. So wow. Right on the heels of it. And then from 1924 through 1934, that next decade, I believe there were 6 women in total who had been elected to the House of Delegates. And then very significantly, for the next 20 years, no women served in the General Assembly.
Wow.
And this was during Jim Crow and during a number of controversies. So when I look at women of particular courage, just as we've talked about the suffragettes and all of the decades that they worked generation after generation, another group that has my tremendous admiration is the group of women, first one elected in 1954, and think of Brown versus the Board of Education, 1954, 1956, another woman was elected, 1958 I think it is, 2 women, including my mentor, Dorothy McDermott, was elected. And the reason why I single out these women for particular badges of courage is that not only were they stepping into a body that hadn't seen any women in 20 years, and therefore in the mind of the people serving, women just did not belong in the General Assembly, but also all of the women were there in opposition to massive resistance brought on by the decision of Brown versus the Board of Education. And Virginia's reaction for more than a decade was to close public schools rather than integrate. And all of these women opposed that position. So again, particular courage. So then, as far as your reference to when I came on the scene, it still fascinates me. When I was elected in 1980, first took the oath of office in 82, there had only been 21 women total since 1924 who had served in the legislature. So we're also coming up on another 100th anniversary of when the first women would have served, and that would be 2024. And at this point, we have only had a total of 78 women in the House of Delegates in this whole period of time. So we've got our work cut out for us just to get 100 women and 100 years in the House of Delegates who have in fact been elected, served as public servants. So my own position, I've just discovered last year when I took the oath of office that then I would be the longest serving woman in the House of Delegates, surpassing my mentor who had served, Dorothy McDermott.
So Janet, I'm going to throw this question out to you, and of course Vivian, Marvin can answer. Why is it so important for women to be part of the government? I mean, you know, I'm going to play devil's advocate here.
Well, we are citizens, equal in every legal way with men. So there is absolutely no reason why those of us who are among the, 51 or 52% of the population shouldn't serve in office, all offices, including the highest offices. It's simply a matter of equity.
And my answer, I have to say honestly, comes out of my own head and my experience. I'm a person. I'm a person born with certain abilities, and I have never found any reason not to follow those abilities. So to be told arbitrarily that because I'm a woman, I can't do what I'm capable of doing, just is such an anathema. And I want to throw in just at this point with your history, Marvin, that when I hear that the Midwestern and Western states pass women's right to vote, it doesn't surprise me because I was raised in Michigan on a small farm, and therefore relate far more to the role of pioneer women who had to be out there on an equal basis with men to make that homestead survive.
I hadn't thought of that.
And I moved to Virginia then after college, and there certainly has been a little bit of I've enjoyed aspects of it, of learning how to be a lady and learning how to make sure that I'm gracious about doors being open for me and all of those things, because culturally that you know, I have no problem at all with those kinds of niceties as long as they're not limiting, as long as they're not you stay in your place. But we definitely get together with our own talents, our own abilities, and then at the risk of going on too long, our own life experiences. And there's no question that women particularly of our generation, who were the ones who had the much larger burden of child rearing as well as aging parents and all of those nurturing demands and responsibilities, so that as we go into public policy, I believe we're just that much more sensitive to the support and partnership that government needs to provide so that we can meet people's needs in the most humane, effective, dignified way in a partnership of supporting all of our family needs along with what government can do, all of the challenges of economic limitations and what that demands, that puts on our day in, day out life. And I do think that women bring more awareness of those demands to the dialogue.
I have my own personal viewpoint on this somewhat as a political progressive. Women are traditionally far more progressive than men, I have found. And if you look at the Supreme Court, the 3 women sitting now on the Supreme Court are quite liberal. And even O'Connor, who was the first woman in the Supreme Court, a Republican, she was much more moderate and progressive than the rest of her colleagues. And so much of our history and our progress depends on the Supreme Court. And I'd love to see 9 women on the Supreme Court.
I don't think any one of us will live to see that, but that's a good goal to have, Marvin. So let's get back a little bit. So they passed the legislation, and now you have this road for ratification. And I'm struck with the fact that it only took a year. And I don't know, there's something called the Equal Rights Amendment that's been in.
We're going to talk about that.
I mean, it goes on, and you want to go, what's the big deal? So why do you think, first, Marvin, it really didn't take that long to ratify?
As I said, I think Wilson had a lot to do with it. He really pushed Congress, and Congress reflects the states, and the states listened to Congress, and they went along with it. And they, I think people realize that this is silly, this is ridiculous. How can we prevent women from voting? And I think it just came home. Equal rights is a little different. We were just talking about one subject, voting, as opposed to so many other things that Equal Rights Amendment reflects. But Vivian, you started to talk about the Equal Rights Amendment. Why don't we go into that?
Let me start with this perspective again, since I've already mentioned coming out of Michigan, University of Michigan. I was reading a piece from the law school on the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Amendment and the role played by a woman who graduated from the University of Michigan Law School, Congressman Martha Griffiths. And of course, the civil rights law was extremely controversial following, again, Brown versus the Board of Education, all of the civil rights marches in Selma and the deaths and all of the tremendous challenges that the nation faced, that this is wrong. But Johnson was dealing with the South, and he had to have enough states to pass the civil rights law, and so the agreement was that there would be no amendments, that Johnson had worked out with his Southern colleagues, a very tenuous agreement on the Civil Rights Act. And Martha Griffiths took the floor after someone else had spoken to a lot of laughter and derision to defend why there needed to be the amendment to add to the Civil Rights Act sex, that there will not be discrimination on the basis of sex as well as race. And laughter started, but as the account I read indicated, with the force of legal argument, again, a capable person able to make very cogent argument saying, as Marvin alluded to, if the 14th Amendment protected us, then we wouldn't have needed the 19th Amendment to get the right to vote. And so we need these protections, and quite frankly, without the successful amendment of the Civil Rights Act, things we now take for granted about Title IX and women being able to compete in sports. A little postscript, I found that to be so important, because as I took my place in the legislature, I'm athletic and I'd played a lot of sports, but not in a competitive way. So when I saw the male colleagues be able to really go flat out in argument and negotiation on a particular bill and then come off the floor and their friends together, I had a little bit of swallowing because I tend to hold it just a little bit tighter. But this is what competitive sports has done for women. It's allowed young women to test themselves physically as well. But also when it comes to employment law, EEOC, all of the things about discrimination against women have come under the Civil Rights Act and have been in very important protections that, again, as I say, many of us take for granted. So now one of the arguments against the Equal Rights Amendment is, well, you don't need it. You've got all these rights. They're not constitutionally protected, which takes us back to why the 19th Amendment, its passage being required because the 14th was regarded as not protecting women. We need that same kind of language in the Equal Rights Amendment to protect these gains in ownership of property, in stature, in inheritance, in a number of things that there's been significant changes in the last 40 years since the Equal Rights Amendment came forward, but again, they are not constitutionally protected.
What I find amazing, Janet, is the fact that it's a word, and the fact that that word was missing. I mean, is that a Supreme Court interpretation? Is it the judges interpreting that, well, there's not that word that says sex?
Well, I will defer to the attorney here as far as what the court views this.
Are you talking about the Equal Rights Amendment?
Well, no, I'm going back to the 14th Amendment,
Oh, okay.
that missing word sex. I mean,
the 15th.
The 15th, I'm
Right.
sorry.
It wasn't even an issue at that point. Not a serious issue.
Again, because women got married, and generally when you got married, you were property of. And inheritance, up until relatively recently in Virginia history, inheritance went to the children before the wife.
Oh, really?
And it took, I'm going to say, probably 30, 35 years ago when we changed in the law, if you die without a will, what the net... Intestate. But those are all nuances of law that reflect a time, and I'm going to say particularly in southern states, where there was more of a I really don't quite know how to describe it, except that when I experienced on the farm in Michigan, as far as partnership, is not quite the same role that the traditional Southern lady has played.
Well, you just have to see Gone with the Wind, and we see that.
But was she tough? Oh, yes, she was tough.
Oh, right, underneath, right.
Underneath.
Well, again, and we had talked earlier before we went on the air that women, not only here but in Britain, before they were married, they had lots of rights. They could own property, they could inherit from their father. But boy, as soon as they got married, that all changed. And as you said, they were property of their husband.
Well, most civilizations have been sexist. You know, the strong male, and they made the rules.
Oh.
And we have some rules today in some countries that are not much different from they were 1,000 years ago. Virginia has a long way to go. Okay, you know, we talk about the 19th Amendment. Virginia didn't ratify it until 1952. Okay, 1952. It took that long for Virginia to ratify the women's right to vote. On the other hand, we have more and more women in the legislature, more and more women involved in politics, as Janice is and some others right here in Greenspring. And that's good. That's very, very important. But I go back in my study of the history of the United States and Supreme Court, that it has been so important over the years. If we had a different Supreme Court, back in the early 1900s, they would have taken the Fourth Amendment and said, yes, you have the right to vote for women. But the Supreme Court wouldn't do that. They just said no.
So we're slowly winding down. So I'm going to have Janet. What is your thoughts of all this?
Well, as Marvin said, you have to take the long view, the historical view. It is, people wonder why things can't change more quickly, but I think it's largely a matter of human nature. So people have to take the long view. There is progress, but it is slow in most cases. And one thing I think Marvin alluded to, the First World War made a real difference in the way people viewed women, because they put their shoulders to the wheel during the war. They became ambulance drivers and nurses. They worked in munitions plants. And it seemed unfair that women could work toward democracy in Europe with the victory in the war and not be able to vote at home. So in a way, history played perhaps a more deciding role than if the First World War had never happened. But as far as Virginia not ratifying the amendment until 1952, at least we weren't last. Mississippi ratified it in 1984. 1984. So things in the South move slowly, more slowly than some of us who grew up elsewhere are comfortable with, but there is movement, there is progress.
Marvin.
It's interesting that you talk about women's role in the First World War, but we also have the women's role in the Second World War, where they worked at factories and they did all these kinds of things. But as soon as the war ended, women went back to their traditional role. And
many of them who served did not get veterans' rights until just recently, or any kind of recognition.
So many things that women had done. But as I said a moment ago, I think that women are quickly advancing within the last couple of years, really. And they're certainly a presence in the legislature, important presence. And so many women are candidates last year and this year. So I think it's looking good for Virginian women.
So Vivian, I'm going to have you have the last word.
Well, I'm going to stay with the theme of the change that history makes. World War II made a huge history, Rosie the Riveter, etc., but it also made a tremendous change as far as blacks who had served honorably, served in the war, and were had experience in countries that didn't have that discrimination, and that led directly to the feelings about Brown versus the Board of Education, and then the civil rights movement right on the heels of World War II. Whereas women, it took substantially longer, in part because of the changes made with the civil rights movement, as black women realized that if I'm going to have the same right as women, I don't want to just be a second-class citizen as a woman. I want to be a full citizen. And so that also was part of the joining together that then saw the women's movement, which now has continued again under the Civil Rights Act and the pushing for the ERA. I will now revert way, way back. I love studying in college about hunter-gatherer societies. And one of the conclusions of anthropologists is that these societies would have failed, would have starved to death if it weren't for the woman who was gathering food wherever it was, and not just the occasional kill of the hunter. And this joining together of the skills of both towards a stronger and stronger society is in fact the challenge that we have ahead of us, rather than a traditional role that because you hold the spear, you have the power.
The club.
The club, whatever.
Or both. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. This has been wonderful. Representative Vivian Watts, who is our representative, so a pleasure to have you.
Truly my pleasure.
And Marvin, of course, you're always welcome to come on, and Janet. come on back and we can continue this discussion. And next year we'll do it again because it will be the ratification.